He ignored the cries of his own child, but when grief turned into revenge, the CEO learned that power could not protect him from the consequences of his choices. Victor Langston was a man who had everything the world could offer: power, wealth, respect, and a reputation that seemed untouchable. He ran a multinational company that made headlines for its success and innovation, and everyone admired him for his sharp mind and his ability to stay calm under pressure. In boardrooms, people listened when he spoke, and in social circles, his presence commanded attention. On the surface, Victor seemed like the perfect man, charismatic, confident, and untouchable, but beneath that polished exterior, he carried secrets that could destroy everything he had built. Among these secrets was his affair with Isabella, a woman who came from a completely different world. Isabella was not wealthy, not powerful, but she was intelligent, beautiful, and clever enough to understand how to capture Victor's attention. Their relationship was a dangerous one, kept hidden from the public eye and from Victor's wife, Margaret. While Victor maintained the appearance of a devoted husband in front of the world, he spent secret hours with Isabella. Drawn to her in ways that his marriage could not satisfy, Isabella loved Victor deeply. But her love was complicated by a sense of longing for recognition and care from him. She carried a child, Ethan, who was Victor's son, and this child became a symbol of her hope, her love, and her desire to be acknowledged by a man who seemed incapable of slowing down for anything outside his own ambitions. She often found herself in moments of quiet desperation, sitting alone with the baby, wishing Victor could see them, could understand the life that had grown from their secret moments. But Victor was always busy. Meetings, trips, boardroom battles, and endless calls seemed to consume him, leaving little room for anything else. Especially for the responsibilities that came with fatherhood, Isabella tried everything she could to reach him. She sent messages, made calls, and sometimes even went to his office, hoping to find a moment when he could stop and listen. But Victor, confident in his position and in the loyalty of his staff, often dismissed her concerns. He assumed that being wealthy and influential was enough to cover the gaps he left in people's lives. To him, care could be outsourced, problems solved by others, and responsibilities managed by assistants. The emotional reality of Isabella and Ethan, however, was different. Their world existed in constant tension between love and neglect, between hope and frustration. As the weeks passed, Isabella noticed Ethan's health declining. The child had always been delicate, but now there were signs of serious illness, persistent fevers, constant crying, and weakness that worried her deeply. She felt an urgent need to tell Victor, to make him understand that their child needed him. But each time she tried, Victor's attention was elsewhere. Sometimes he sounded distracted on the phone, promising to deal with it soon, or assuring her that everything was under control. But Isabella knew it wasn't. No one could care for Ethan the way Victor could, or the way he should have. Victor, meanwhile, lived in a bubble of ambition and indulgence. He attended gala events, made high-stakes business deals, and kept up the appearance of a man in control of everything. In his mind, the world was predictable, manageable, and beneath his scrutiny. Everyone else could handle what was necessary, but the reality outside his carefully curated world was far harsher. Isabella's worries grew heavier with each passing day, and the weight of helplessness began to press on her. She loved Victor, yes, but the feeling was now tangled with anger and fear. Fear for Ethan, fear of losing him, and anger at a man who could have made a difference but chose not to. Despite the tension, were fleeting moments of joy. When Victor did show up, even briefly, Isabella felt a rush of happiness. He could still charm her with a smile or a few kind words, and in those moments, the world seemed right. Ethan would giggle when Victor held him, and for a while, the small family felt like something close to normal. But these moments were fleeting, fragile bubbles that burst too quickly. Victor's return to his busy life was always abrupt, leaving Isabella to carry the emotional and physical burden alone. She began to notice a pattern. Victor's attention was always controlled, measured, given only when convenient, and withdrawn when he faced real demands. The imbalance of care became painfully clear. She bore the weight of motherhood. Illness and fear, while Victor maintained the illusion of control without ever truly being present. This realization hurt, but it also planted the seeds of a quiet tension that would grow into something stronger later. Isabella's life became a careful balancing act. She had to manage Ethan's care, her own emotions, and the precarious situation with Victor. She had to act normal when he visited, to smile and hide her exhaustion, and to keep the fragile piece of their hidden life intact. But deep down, she began to wonder what would happen if Victor never truly noticed her struggle. If his negligence continued, and if Ethan's life was at risk because of it. These thoughts were terrifying, but she could not escape them. Victor, unaware of the growing crisis, continued to live as if nothing had changed. He had a confidence that bordered on arrogance, believing his influence could fix anything he wanted fixed. He did not yet see the fragility of the life he had helped create, the delicate thread on which Ethan's health and Isabella's hope rested. And in that ignorance lay the beginning of a story that would shift dramatically, a story of love, neglect, and the consequences of choices made in comfort. While others suffered, the tension between their worlds, the high-rise offices and gala parties versus the quiet, anxious hours at home set the stage for a dramatic unraveling. Isabella's worry for Ethan and Victor's oblivion created a stark contrast, showing not just the power of the man but the vulnerability of those who depended on him. It was a world where appearances mattered more than reality, and where the cost of neglect was growing heavier every day. In this fragile balance, the story of Victor, Isabella, and Ethan began to take shape. A story that would soon explode in grief, anger, and revenge. As the consequences of inattention and selfish ambition started to reveal themselves in the harshest possible way, the night air was heavy with tension and fear as Isabella paced around the small apartment she shared with Ethan. The baby's breathing had grown shallow and uneven, and every sound made her heart leap in panic. She had tried to call Victor earlier, sending messages that went unanswered, and each passing minute made her desperation grow. She knew his attention was somewhere else, perhaps at a lavish party, perhaps with other distractions, but right now, none of that mattered. What mattered was the tiny life depending on her. Ethan's condition worsened quickly. His tiny body was frail, and his cries were weak, almost ghostly. Isabella tried to soothe him, rocking him gently and whispering soft words of encouragement, but her fear kept rising. She thought about all the times she had warned Victor, about the calls and texts she had sent, and how he had brushed them aside. She remembered how he always sounded distracted, promising he would come soon, or that everything would be fine. But now, everything was far from fine. The weight of helplessness pressed on her chest like a heavy stone. Hours passed, and Isabella found herself staring at Ethan, willing him to hold on just a little longer. She felt a strange mix of anger and sorrow. Anger at Victor for ignoring his responsibilities. Anger at the cruel twist of fate that had put her and her child in this vulnerable position. And sorrow at the helplessness of holding a life that might slip away at any moment. She whispered his name, promising him that everything would be okay, though inside she feared she might be lying to both him and herself. Victor, in his world of lights and luxury, had no idea what was happening. He was at a gala, surrounded by influential people and flashing cameras. He laughed, made deals, and seemed completely untouchable. Even when his phone buzzed with repeated messages from Isabella, he ignored them, confident that someone else would handle any problems, or perhaps thinking she was overreacting. He had built a life where consequences seemed distant, where his power could solve anything, or so he believed. Meanwhile, Isabella's panic reached a new level. Ethan's breathing became more erratic, and she realized that he might not make it without immediate help. She called doctors and rushed to get medical advice, but the urgency was constant, and time seemed to move agonizingly slowly. Each second felt like an eternity, and each breath he took was a reminder of the fragility of life and the consequences of Victor's neglect. Finally, the unthinkable happened. Ethan took his last breath in Isabella's arms. The small life that had been so full of hope, so full of potential, was gone. Isabella collapsed with grief, her sobs echoing in the empty apartment. She felt a wave of numbness mixed with fury. The anger at Victor, who had been oblivious to the crisis, mingled with the sorrow of loss, creating a pain so deep it seemed impossible to bear. She had warned him, she had reached out, and yet he had been absent when it mattered most. When Victor finally received the news, it was not from Isabella, but from a nurse who had been trying to contact him. The call was abrupt, formal, and cold, and for the first time, Victor experienced the shock of reality. He was stunned, not just at the death of his son, but at the magnitude of what he had ignored. The world he had built, a world of wealth and control, suddenly felt powerless in the face of raw human loss. For a moment, he was speechless, unsure of what to do. And it was a feeling he was not accustomed to. Isabella's grief, however, was transforming into something else. While sorrow had filled her heart, it was now joined by a cold, sharp determination. She had lost Ethan, yes, but she refused to let the injustice of Victor's neglect go unanswered. Every pang of loss and heartbreak became fuel for a growing resolve. She began to think about how she could hold him accountable, how she could make him feel the weight of what his absence had caused. Her love for her child did not diminish. It strengthened her focus on retribution. The world around Victor continued, as if nothing had changed. He returned home, expecting life to continue smoothly. But the emptiness in Isabella's eyes and the coldness in her voice made it impossible to ignore the consequences of his neglect. The realization that his child had died while he slept or enjoyed himself in another world hit him with brutal clarity. He felt a mix of guilt, panic, and fear, emotions that were foreign to a man who had always believed in his invincibility. Isabella began to quietly plan her next steps. She knew that revenge was not simply about confrontation. It had to be calculated, precise, and undeniable. She could not let her anger lead to rash actions. She needed to be smarter than Victor, to understand his weaknesses and exploit them with care. Her grief was a shield and a weapon, quiet storm building beneath the surface. Victor's arrogance and ignorance had given Isabella the leverage she needed. He had underestimated her strength, assuming that grief would render her powerless. He had believed that control and wealth were enough to manage the consequences of his actions. But he was wrong. The loss of Ethan had shifted the balance, and Isabella began to see the world differently. Every detail of his life, every vulnerability, became a potential piece in the intricate plan she would craft. As Isabella looked at the empty crib, the memories of her child became both a wound and a motivation. She remembered his laughter, the first time he reached for her, the small moments that now felt unbearably precious. These memories, filled with love and loss, were transformed into determination. She would not let Victor escape the consequences of his choices. She would not allow his power to shield him from the pain he had caused in the weeks that followed. The atmosphere between Victor and Isabella changed. Where there had once been secrecy, charm, and longing, now there was tension, unspoken accusations, and a quiet warning. Isabella carried herself differently, her grief refined into a silent strength. Victor sensed it, felt it in every interaction, but he could not yet understand the depth of the storm he had ignited. The child he had ignored while he slept or indulged himself was gone. And with that loss, the foundations of his carefully controlled life were beginning to shake. Ethan's death was a turning point. It marked the end of innocence and the beginning of consequences. Isabella's sorrow was no longer just grief. It was the start of a plan, a careful, deliberate strategy to ensure that Victor would face what he had avoided for so long. She had lost a child, but she had not lost her resolve. Each day became a reminder of what was taken, what was neglected, and what had to be balanced. The quiet hours of mourning were also hours of preparation. Victor, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of the growing storm. He felt guilt, yes, but it was fleeting, overshadowed by the belief that wealth, power, and charm could solve or hide any problem. He did not yet see Isabella as a threat, not as someone who could dismantle the life he had built, piece by piece. And that underestimation would be his greatest mistake in the shadows of grief. Isabella began to understand her own strength. The helplessness she had felt when Ethan was dying transformed into clarity. She realized that Victor's neglect had not only caused tragedy, but it also exposed the cracks in his character. These cracks, she decided, would be the pathway for her revenge. Her sorrow had sharpened into focus, and the world would soon witness a reckoning unlike anything Victor had ever imagined. The night of Ethan's passing marked the end of one chapter and the silent beginning of another. Isabella's world was forever changed, filled with loss, anger, and determination. Victor's world, still gleaming and confident on the surface, had a hidden fracture forming one that would grow until it could no longer be ignored. And as the days passed, both Victor and Isabella would begin a journey that neither could have anticipated, betrayed by grief, betrayal, and the burning desire for justice. Isabella's grief had settled into a quiet, burning determination. The pain of losing Ethan had not destroyed her. Instead, it sharpened her mind and focused her energy on something that Victor could never ignore. She realized that his negligence had not only cost a life, but had exposed his true nature: selfish, arrogant, and blind to the needs of those who depended on him. Now, she had a purpose: to make him face the consequences of his actions in a way that would reach him deeply, painfully, and unmistakably. At first, Isabella moved cautiously. She understood that Victor's world was vast and well-protected, that his wealth and influence acted as shields against most threats. She could not simply confront him and expect him to crumble. He had lived his life believing he was untouchable. She had to be smarter, more precise, and patient. She started by quietly observing him, noticing his habits, weaknesses, and the way he interacted with people in his company. Everything Victor valued: his image, his influence, his business would become part of her plan. Her first step was to gain control over the elements of his life that were often taken for granted. She reached out to people in Victor's business network, friends who had been quietly disgruntled by his arrogance or ignored by him in the past. Using her intelligence and charm, she began planting seeds of influence, slowly creating a web of connections that could subtly undermine his empire. She learned which projects were vulnerable, which partnerships could be strained, and which allies could be turned into liabilities. Everything she did was deliberate. Nothing was left to chance. Meanwhile, Victor continued his life as usual. He attended meetings, made public appearances, and maintained the polished image of a man in control. Yet Isabella's careful moves began to create small, almost imperceptible disruptions. A project that had always run smoothly suddenly faced delays. A critical investor started questioning decisions, and subtle errors began appearing in areas where Victor trusted others completely. At first, he dismissed these incidents as coincidences, minor setbacks that could be managed by his usual decisiveness and charm. But the pattern grew. No matter how hard Victor tried to control his world, the disruptions multiplied. Projects that should have succeeded failed. Reputations that had once been secure wavered. And the people who had always supported him began expressing doubts. Victor felt a creeping unease that he could not explain. He had underestimated the quiet forces working behind the scenes, forces that were methodical, patient, and intelligent. Slowly, he began to sense that someone close, someone who understood his world intimately, was orchestrating these failures. Isabella's strategy was not reckless. It was precise. She made sure that every action she took appeared accidental, as if the universe itself were conspiring against Victor rather than a woman he had ignored. She leaked small pieces of information to competitors, misdirected communications, and used her understanding of human nature to manipulate those around him. Victor, ever confident in his control, was unaware that his empire was being undermined from within, and that each small disruption was part of a larger design. As the days turned into weeks, Victor's confidence began to falter. He had built a life on certainty, on the belief that his influence could manage any crisis. But now, uncertainty crept in. Investors called with concerns he could not immediately explain. Employees whispered about failures that made no sense, and even his closest advisors began to question his judgment. For the first time, Victor felt the vulnerability he had never allowed himself to feel. He was powerful, yes, but power was no longer a guarantee of control. Isabella, watching from the sidelines, remained calm. Her grief had transformed into patience, her anger into strategy. She knew that true revenge was not about immediate confrontation. It was about letting the person feel the weight of their neglect in every aspect of their life. Victor would not see her coming because she was careful to remain invisible in the chaos she created. To the outside world, Isabella was still the grieving woman, broken by loss, but in reality, she was the quiet storm moving through Victor's carefully ordered life. There were moments when Isabella almost faltered, when the memory of Ethan made her heart ache so deeply that her plans seemed impossible to continue. Yet she pushed through, using the pain to fuel her determination. Every memory of holding Ethan, of seeing his tiny face, reminded her why Victor had to face consequences. Her actions were no longer just for herself. They were for the child she had lost, and for the justice that child deserved. Victor, sensing the growing pressure, began taking more drastic measures. He increased his involvement in his business, personally overseeing projects he would normally delegate. He tried to repair strained relationships, to control damage before it spread further. But with each attempt, Isabella was one step ahead, ensuring that every effort he made was either delayed, misdirected, or undermined in subtle ways. He could feel his world slipping, but he could not see the source of the shift. The contrast between Isabella's quiet control and Victor's frantic attempts to maintain order highlighted the transformation in both their lives. Isabella, once helpless and fearful, had become precise, calculating, and confident. Victor, once untouchable and assured, had become reactive, anxious, and increasingly vulnerable. The balance of power had shifted, and yet Victor still believed that he could regain control if only he worked harder. Not realizing that he was already trapped in Isabella's carefully constructed design, this period of subtle warfare taught Isabella many things. She learned how people acted under pressure, how ego and ambition could cloud judgment, and how small disruptions, when timed correctly, could have massive consequences. She discovered the strength within herself, the resilience to take action even while grieving, and the intelligence to plan a strategy that could not be easily undone. Her grief had become a tool, a weapon against the man who had caused her so much pain. As Isabella moved forward, she began to consider the next steps in her plan. She would not stop at minor disruptions. She wanted Victor to feel the full impact of his neglect. She started to identify areas of his life that he valued most: his public image, his financial empire, and his personal pride, and she began designing ways to attack those areas indirectly, in ways that would leave him no room to defend himself. Every move was calculated, every action part of a larger plan that was growing more complete with each passing day. Victor, meanwhile, was experiencing a mix of confusion, frustration, and rising anger. The sense of control that had defined him for decades was slipping through his fingers, and he could not understand why. He blamed luck, competitors, and even himself. But he could not see that a single person, a woman he had neglected, was the architect of his unraveling. The realization, when it would finally come, promised to be devastating, but for now, Isabella remained a ghost in his life, invisible yet omnipresent. By the end of this phase, Isabella had transformed completely. She was no longer just a grieving mother. She had become a strategist, a silent force capable of bringing down a man who once seemed untouchable. Every small act of disruption, every carefully planned misstep, was part of her larger vision. Victor's empire, once solid and secure, was now vulnerable, and he could feel it even if he did not yet understand why. The story had shifted. The balance of power, once held entirely by Victor, had moved to Isabella. She was patient, relentless, and intelligent, waiting for the precise moment to escalate her plan. Victor, blinded by arrogance and confidence, was unaware that the storm he had ignored in his life was not only coming, it was already here. Isabella's grief had become her strength, her strategy, and her weapon. The consequences for Victor were only just beginning. Victor's world, once untouchable and shining with power, began to crack. What had started as small, almost invisible disruptions now turned into a wave of chaos that he could no longer ignore. Every part of his life that he had taken for granted, the smooth running of his company, the loyalty of his employees, the support of his investors, and even his public image started to show signs of weakness. Projects failed despite his oversight. Trusted partners questioned his decisions, and rumors began circulating that shook the foundation of his empire. For the first time, Victor felt real fear, a sharp, gnawing anxiety he had never experienced before. He tried to regain control. He held emergency meetings, called advisors, and scrutinized every deal and every project. He demanded explanations for failures that seemed impossible, but no answer satisfied him. Every step he took to fix the problems led only to new complications, as if someone or something was always one step ahead. It wasn't long before the reality hit him. This was not random. This was intentional. Someone knew him, understood him, and was deliberately dismantling the world he had built so carefully. Meanwhile, Isabella's plan moved forward with precision. She had built a network of influence, contacts, and subtle manipulations that allowed her to stay invisible while causing maximum disruption. Every mistake, every problem that Victor faced was traced back to her carefully planted moves. But he could not yet connect the dots. She had become a ghost in his life, a shadow he could feel but could not see. Every time he tried to predict what would happen next, she had already anticipated it, ensuring that he remained off balance, anxious, and frustrated. Victor's frustration grew, and with it, his anger. He began lashing out at employees and colleagues, demanding loyalty and perfection. But his rage only made things worse. People started to fear him, and instead of motivating them, his harshness caused mistakes to multiply. Projects he had once overseen with confidence now fell apart under pressure. Contracts that seemed secure suddenly faced disputes, and investors began questioning their involvement in his ventures. His world was unraveling, and he could feel the walls closing in. But he still did not know who was orchestrating the collapse. Isabella, watching from the sidelines, remained calm. She understood Victor's weaknesses better than anyone. She knew how his ego worked, how his need for control blinded him, and how desperation could make him make mistakes he would normally avoid. She began targeting the areas he cared about most: his public reputation, his financial security, and his personal pride. Every move was calculated, designed to make him question his own judgment, and to show him that the life he thought he controlled was slipping through his fingers. Victor's personal life, too, started to suffer. Friends who had once admired him now looked at him with hesitation. Margaret, his wife, sensed the tension in his demeanor and began asking questions he could not answer. People who had once been loyal began to distance themselves, either out of fear, frustration, or uncertainty about his stability. Even his public image, carefully polished for years, became a subject of whispers and speculation. Victor, who had always believed that wealth and power could solve everything, was now learning that there are some forces even he cannot control. The tension between Victor and Isabella grew more intense. Every interaction was charged, every meeting a battlefield of unspoken challenges. Isabella no longer showed the helpless grief that Victor had expected to see. Instead, she carried herself with quiet confidence, her gaze steady and unflinching. Victor sensed it, felt the threat in her silence, but he still could not understand the full extent of her strategy. Her power lay in her invisibility, in her ability to orchestrate chaos while remaining hidden in plain sight. Victor's attempts to regain control became increasingly desperate. He tried to tighten his grip on the company, increasing oversight, monitoring every project, and punishing mistakes. But Isabella had already anticipated his moves. Every plan he implemented was met with subtle sabotage. Every decision he made was undermined by her careful manipulations. The harder he tried to assert control, the more chaotic things became, the more vulnerable he appeared to the outside world. Investors and partners began to question his leadership openly. Contracts that were previously secure faced legal complications. Competitors, alerted by subtle leaks and insider hints, began to exploit weaknesses in his company. Employees whispered about failures they had once ignored, now emboldened to speak openly. Victor felt cornered, a sensation he had never experienced in his life of power and privilege. Fear and anger battled inside him, clouding his judgment, making him desperate and reactive, which only played into Isabella's hands. Isabella's control was precise. She made sure that Victor's missteps were highly visible, ensuring that every failure, every sign of weakness, would not only affect him but also be noticed by the world. Her revenge was not just about hurting him. It was about dismantling the image of untouchable power that he had built over decades. Each small victory against him was a reminder that his neglect had consequences far greater than he had imagined. The psychological toll on Victor was immense. He had always believed that intelligence, charm, and money could protect him from almost anything. Now he was learning that even the most powerful person could be vulnerable to someone who understood their weaknesses. He began losing sleep, became irritable, and started second-guessing every decision. Meetings that once gave him confidence now filled him with anxiety. Every call, every message, every business report became a source of stress because he could no longer predict the outcome. Isabella's invisible hand had created a reality in which he was never certain, never secure, and never in control. In parallel, Isabella's confidence grew. She had turned her grief into strategy, her anger into patience, and her loss into a calculated drive for justice. Every action she took was deliberate, ensuring that Victor would feel the consequences of his neglect in every corner of his life. She was no longer the helpless mother who had feared losing her child. She was a force moving through his world, reshaping it piece by piece, leaving him struggling to grasp the full scope of what was happening. The collapse was not just financial or professional, it was personal. Victor could feel the isolation creeping in, the loss of control extending into his personal relationships. People he had relied on for support were now distant or cautious. He had underestimated Isabella's intelligence and resolve, believing that grief would make her powerless. He had been wrong. Every move he had ignored, every warning he had dismissed, was now being returned to him in ways he could not escape. As the days passed, Victor's panic and frustration grew. He was no longer the confident, untouchable CEO. He was a man exposed, vulnerable, and desperate. Isabella had mastered patience, waiting for him to make mistakes, while she guided the environment around him. She had become the architect of his downfall, and he was still unaware of the depth of her influence. The tension reached a point where every interaction, every phone call, and every decision became a potential threat, a potential trap set by the woman he had underestimated. The psychological impact on Victor was complete. His sense of control, the foundation of his identity, was crumbling. Isabella's silent, calculated moves had destabilized every aspect of his life. He could no longer rely on his instincts, his charm, or his wealth to fix the problems, because the chaos was no longer random. It was intentional, methodical, and unstoppable. Isabella had not only struck at his business, but at his very sense of self, showing him that even power and arrogance cannot protect someone from the consequences of neglect and cruelty. By the end of this period, the story had shifted dramatically. Victor was no longer untouchable. His empire was vulnerable, his relationships strained, and his mind filled with fear and uncertainty. Isabella, once the grieving mother, had become a strategic force, quietly dismantling everything he valued and preparing for the final stage of her revenge. The balance of power had shifted entirely, and Victor was only beginning to understand the storm that had been unleashed in his life, a storm he could no longer control. Victor Langston stood at the edge of a life he had once controlled completely, feeling the weight of everything he had ignored. His empire, once untouchable and secure, was crumbling around him. Investors were pulling out, competitors were exploiting weaknesses. His own employees, once loyal, whispered openly about his failures. His public image, the carefully crafted mask of power and perfection, was in tatters. Victor's every move now seemed clumsy and desperate, stark contrast to the confident man who had once commanded attention wherever he went. Isabella had orchestrated all of this with quiet precision. She had never acted recklessly. Every disruption, every misstep in Victor's world had been calculated, designed to teach him a lesson he would never forget. Now, she was ready for the final stage. Her revenge would not only affect his business and reputation, but would strike at the heart of his pride, his ego, and his sense of invulnerability. She had waited patiently, using grief and strategy to create the perfect storm. And now it was time for him to confront the full consequences of his neglect. Victor, for the first time in his life, felt fear in a way he had never experienced before. It was not fear of failure or loss of money, but fear of a force that could reach him personally, that understood his weaknesses, and that could dismantle everything he valued most. He had underestimated Isabella, dismissing her grief as weakness, believing she would remain powerless. That belief had been his fatal mistake. Every aspect of his life now bore the mark of her intelligence and determination in the public eye. Victor faced a series of scandals that shook his credibility. Isabella had leaked evidence of his neglect, his affair, and his disregard for responsibility in ways that could not be ignored. Media outlets, once friendly or neutral, now covered stories that questioned his ethics, his character, and his ability to lead. Investors who had once trusted him blindly now hesitated, wary of the risks. Each new article, each whisper in social circles, chipped away at the empire he had built over decades. He could no longer hide behind wealth or charm. The consequences were visible and undeniable. At the same time, Isabella targeted his personal world. She reached out to those close to Victor, subtly influencing opinions, revealing truths he had hoped to keep hidden, and demonstrating the depth of his negligence. People he had once considered allies now looked at him with doubt or outright suspicion. Margaret, his wife, finally confronted him about the lies and secrecy that had defined their relationship. Victor, for the first time, was forced to face the isolation that comes when trust is broken completely. He realized that wealth and power could not protect him from the consequences of his actions, and the understanding filled him with a helpless rage. Isabella's revenge was merciless but precise. She did not humiliate Victor with public confrontation. She dismantled him systematically, showing him that his life, which he had taken for granted, could fall apart quietly, piece by piece. Every failed deal, every lost investor, every whispered suspicion was a reminder of his negligence. Every disruption was invisible in its origin, but devastating in its effect. Victor felt powerless because he could not fight an enemy he could not see, did not understand until it was too late. The psychological toll on Victor grew heavier each day. His sleepless nights were filled with anxiety, panic, and self-recrimination. He replayed memories of Ethan, realizing how his absence, his neglect, his arrogance had led to the death of the child who had been his own son. Guilt gnawed at him, but guilt alone could not undo the damage he had caused. Isabella had transformed her grief into power, and Victor was facing a woman who was no longer vulnerable, but unstoppable. The balance of control, once firmly in his hands, had shifted completely as Victor scrambled to salvage what remained of his business and reputation. Isabella continued to operate with calm, deliberate intelligence. She knew exactly which levers to pull, which people to influence, and how to make him confront the full impact of his past choices. She did not need to shout, accuse, or threaten. Her actions spoke louder than words. Each subtle maneuver reminded him of his failures. Each loss underscored his inability to protect or control what he had once taken for granted. The world around Victor became a reflection of his neglect, a constant, unrelenting reminder of the child he had ignored. The climax of Isabella's revenge came. Victor finally tried to confront her directly. He demanded explanations, apologies, or answers. But Isabella did not give him the satisfaction of a straightforward confrontation. Instead, she let the truth emerge slowly through evidence, witnesses, and public exposure. Victor was forced to witness the consequences of his choices in full, unable to manipulate, ignore, or control the narrative. The empire he had built, the reputation he had cherished, and the life he had assumed would remain intact were all slipping away. One undeniable fact at a time, Victor's desperation reached a peak. He attempted legal action, tried to silence critics, and used every resource at his disposal to regain control. But Isabella had anticipated each move. Her strategy had been layered, sophisticated, and resilient. Every attack he launched only highlighted his vulnerability, further proving that he had underestimated her intelligence and determination. Victor, for the first time in his life, was trapped in a situation he could not dominate. a reality where every action seemed to worsen his plight. Finally, Victor was forced to face the full scale of his downfall. The public had turned against him, his investors had abandoned him, and even those who had once admired him no longer trusted him. His wealth remained, but its power to protect him had vanished. His relationships were fractured, his credibility destroyed, and his confidence shattered. He realized in painful clarity that the consequences of ignoring responsibility, neglecting the people who mattered, and prioritizing selfish desires over morality could not be undone. Isabella had not only taught him a lesson but had reshaped his entire life. Isabella, in contrast, stood firmly in the aftermath. She had lost a child, yes, but she had gained strength, clarity, and justice. Her plan had been executed with precision, ensuring that Victor could never ignore the pain he had caused. She did not celebrate his suffering out of malice. She sought justice for Ethan, for herself, and for the truth that Victor had disregarded. Her revenge was complete because it was purposeful, deliberate, undeniable. The story concluded with Victor left to reflect on his failures. He understood, too late, that power and wealth alone could not protect him from the consequences of neglect, dishonesty, and selfishness. Isabella, scarred but resolute, had reclaimed control over her life, demonstrating that intelligence, patience, and strategy could triumph over arrogance and privilege. She walked away knowing that Ethan's death could never be undone, but the balance of justice had been restored, and the only way that mattered, Victor had felt the consequences of his actions fully, painfully, and irrevocably. In the end, the narrative was not only about revenge, but about awareness and consequence. It was a lesson in human responsibility and the cost of negligence, and in the power of one person to change the fate of another, even against seemingly insurmountable odds. Isabella's journey showed that grief could be transformed into strength, sorrow into strategy, and loss into a catalyst for change. Victor's downfall, total and undeniable, became a testament to the truth that no amount of power or privilege can protect someone from the consequences of their actions when faced with someone who refuses to be ignored.